Thank you for watching and listening to Life with Strings Attached. This is part 2 of my conversation with Kosta Lagis. If you haven't listened to part 1, we suggest you do that first.
There's this perception that the client, that and I've heard this a few times, it's ridiculously arrogant. They'll get a hold of these tools and they won't need the artist anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not so sure about that, because you're thinking of the artist like a craftsman. Mm-hmm, you're not thinking of the artistic side of it.
Yeah.
And at what point will your creativity or lack thereof start to show? Mm-hmm. I think that's a hugely important thing to consider, is that a lot of us got into this because we're creative people, and we ended up making a living of the craft associated with that creativity. That earns the money, but the creativity is still there, and that I think it's maybe in a little bit of danger right now.
I'm very pleased to have Kosta Lagis as my guest today on Life with Strings Attached. Kosta Lagis is the creative director for computer graphics at the Mill in Shanghai, with over 25 years of experience in film, advertising, and industrial design. He has worked extensively as an artist and technical director on films such as Prometheus, Man of Steel, and Deadpool, and has directed a number of commercial projects with clients such as Huawei, Oppo, and Mobil. He has an extensive technical background in illustration, photography, digital imaging, and audio production, and is currently exploring the technical and creative impact of AI-based imaging, leveraging this technology and leaving room to ponder the long-term ethical ramifications of its use. I've very much enjoyed my conversation today with Kosta Lagis. I hope that you do as much as I did. I still believe that fundamentally we're moving towards needs and away from things that we don't need. And sometimes we make mistakes. And sometimes there are societal changes that mean that a portion of our society isn't going to evolve. They're not going to pass on the replicator genes. And people don't really want to talk about that.
I really do. I want you to tell me more.
Ultimately, if we think about the evolution of our species and the evolution of all life on Earth, it is to pass it on.
Okay.
Which, here's where we're getting a lot of shit, but I'll say it anyways.
Go.
Which means that anything that prevents you from passing it on is fundamentally an evolutionary failure.
Okay.
Whether that is societal, psychological, or physical. But, there is a sadness when a couple who wants to have a child cannot have a child. There's a deep, deep sadness that happens. And I've witnessed it in many women who chose to delay the idea of having a child, or wasn't sure if they were going to have a child, and then came to it later in life where it's too late for them. And they've accomplished a lot, but there's still a deep sadness about not being able to have a child and pass it on. And this is really unpopular to talk about in our culture. And I think it's a really big problem, because we talk about science, we talk about evolution, but the very fundamental part is one gene replicating to the second gene. And then the fact that the DNA doesn't last very long. The DNA strand was a bit of a fluke. And so it was encapsulated within a lipid, which made it a little bit more impervious to the environment, and then a protein, and the protein gave it propulsion. But the protein has two capacities, which we consider to be the basis of intelligence. And that capacity is perception. So it can perceive when it's too hot or too cold, or running out of energy. Entropy is a problem, right? And then it can create propulsion. It can create movement. And so movement and perception are the very fundamental beginnings of intelligence. And that's that moving towards what we need and moving away from what we don't need. But the way that we solved the problem of entropy is by replication. And so we replicate and we replicate and we replicate. That's the evolutionary solution. And we find ways to replicate, if we look at at Darwin's sort of basic theories, where we all think of the word evolution from, it's the evolution of species that had an advantage with their particular type of vision or their bill or the way they breathed or whatever it happened to be, which meant that when the environment changed, one was able to survive and the other one was not. It wasn't because one was much better at adapting in their brain. It was an evolutionary advantage to this particular environmental change. And so, but the only thing this all has in common is replication and passing it on. And that's Dawkins' sort of work, where he talks about, Richard Dawkins became very famous for this idea of replicator genes and passing it on survival machines. And the basis of intelligence starts right there also. And so there's a fundamental thing that we have to deal with in society right now. And that is the idea that having children is actually important. And caring for them and passing on ideas is actually important. The matter of fact, the survival of our species and our societies fundamentally depend upon it. And we downplay it like having children is for people who think like old people. Like Jesus, come on. Like the amount of ignorance it takes to arrive at the conclusion that I am the result of millions of years of evolution, but I'm going to decide I don't feel like it.
Yeah. Have I lost you?
I'm still here.
Oh, yeah, okay, cool. I got you.
The idea that I don't feel like passing it on. Millions of years of evolution, and a lot of people suffered to get me here, but I don't feel like passing it on. I think it's just not a good enough reason. And if our society feels that way, we have a problem.
Yeah, I was kind of waiting for you to say something super controversial there, but I don't know if you did. Maybe I'm kind of a little old and conservative in that way as well, but I would 100% agree with that. Obviously, the species must continue, and that's very deeply programmed into our very base level. You can look at even the most primitive organisms operate in the same way. There are things living on your skin that operate the same way. It's to me, I think we sort of touched on this. One of the first things we spoke about last time we spoke was
your daughter.
Yes,
yes,
my daughter. Which to me, I remember, and I'll tell the story again. But it's not a very long one. But when I first got to Sydney, I was working with a guy called Laurent Huguenot, who's an amazing CG artist, and older guy now. He did Gladiator and a bunch of things. He's phenomenal and an absolutely amazing guy. He's got this very patient temperament, which I kind of required back then because I was a little bit of, had a bit of a rock star brain. And he we went over. My wife and I went over to his house for dinner. He introduced us to his son and his new daughter, and he introduced his son, and he told me, that his children were the only thing he had ever made that mattered, and I never knew what that meant until I kind of, we had our daughter, and suddenly. Everything that we've just spent 2 hours discussing, the whole career and everything, it just seemed utterly irrelevant, after that moment. It really did. To me, it was the only thing that mattered and kind of the point of living. And it was probably the first time in my entire life I was kind of okay with the idea of not being alive anymore. Which is it sounds like a weird thing to say, but it's kind of like, it was almost like I kind of was a little bit more okay with death at that point, whereas before I'd cling screaming to whatever kept me alive. I probably still would.
Sure,
but
and you should probably.
But that just the idea that sort of process of existential thought. The end isn't such a horrible thing now. Because suddenly it's not the end, and you see yourself in that little person, and you got to be real careful what you say around this little person and all this other stuff. It's the only thing I've made that matters. I completely understand what he meant, and it took me a long time to get it, but ultimately you need to know. And it's like a bunch of little switches go off in your head, and you're just transformed. And it was a long road to get there. I had a kid pretty late. I wish I had it 10 years earlier, but it's fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is all that matters. But I do think, like, what's really interesting is that sometimes I also like to break things down to a pretty base level when you describe like human behavior, human desire, all these sorts of things, because that's not so distant and cold that we can't understand that, and we can't really sometimes rationalize what you would say is bizarre behavior. It makes perfect sense through that. It's not even a lens; it's the removal of a lens. To look at things that way. So there's that. But I think that's not a reason necessarily to remove the poetry, the music, the art, the emotion from things. Those are real things too. They're just piled on top of that. That doesn't mean they're not real. They are real. They're as real as the door and the atoms that make it up. It's still a freaking door. We have to quantify things objectively at some point. We can't just say, well, that's a cluster that's vibrations, that's atoms, that's how many atoms. No, that's a computer monitor. That's how we classify things. Same with emotions. We can talk about, that's this part of the brain reacting in this sort of way, or we could just say that's sadness. For convenience sake, we can call it sadness. And that's linked to how to communicate that and how to empathize with that. And I think that's a hugely important thing. Empathy is something a couple of people I've worked with in the past are clearly incapable of.
But it's not a good long-term strategy. Right. And so all of this is, and again, I'm sorry, I'm going to try and tie in this emotional part with the technical part of it, is that actually we are chemical beings, right? And this, we identify the chemicals now. You've talked about dopamine a couple of times in this conversation, and learning how to trigger a positive dopamine response is part of us succeeding in communication. And so it's part, and so when we succeed in communication, that makes us more effective, and being more effective actually is part of a survival strategy. I don't mean to manipulate, but I just mean we all have to move a little more towards what we need and a little further away from what we don't need. And there are responses that are happening. We can't understand every single moment that's happening within our brain. It's why it's so hard to replicate, but we need to have the most useful low resolution version of it. And that's kind of what narrative is. That's how we feel when we see one color versus another. Is there's a whole bunch of information in our brain which confines it into one narrative, which releases a chemical response for us that says, I like that. Let's move more in that direction. I'm going to spend more time doing that, less time doing that other thing that made me feel pretty awful or scared or cold or whatever it was. We're still moving in the direction of what is useful and away from what is
of course
what is not. And I don't think that emotion, I think that anybody who breaks down emotion, well, actually, here, I'm going to say something possibly provocative. I'll pick up the challenge again, but I'm going to try and quote someone else, actually. Jimmy Carr recently said this about religion. He said there's two kinds of fools in the world. One who thinks that religion is everything, and the other ones who think that religion is nothing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. The fact that every human culture everywhere in the world, as long as we can have recorded history from, has created some type of narrative that we call religion is evidence that it's useful. And to completely discard it and call those people fools is probably not a good long-term strategy. And we're probably not recognizing something about our own humanity by doing so.
No, well, look, 100%. And there was, I can't remember the author's name, but I read a book many years ago, not that long ago, but it was called Darwin's Cathedral. And it was about the evolutionary purpose of religious thought. I'm not a religious guy, but I'm not some guy that walks around telling religious people they're full of shit either. Because I don't think that's I don't have all the answers. I'm pretty absurd. Like I quite like the absurdist point of view, to be honest. So as long as you're not encroaching on me, then whatever. But the really interesting thing about this was it talked about the stepping stones for how we arrived at the scientific method, you know, and also, you know, things like painting, you know, poetry, music especially, actually. You know, language itself was heavily influenced by this. Not just by, because people talk about religion and they think, you know, Catholic Church and Pope John Paul or whatever, or whatever Pope we have now, I don't know. But it's more about a religious thought that the you know, this adherence to this. I don't really know. Nitti and Smart tried to define religion with these 7 dimensions, but I'm not sure if that's still a current way of looking at it. But this idea of you know, religious thought, and you know, nowadays we you know, we have probably you know, this blossoming atheist sort of movement. And I love the kind of the justification of it. People say, well, how can you know, what religion are you? And you say, I'm an atheist. I don't have one. And then people say, well, how can you not have one? And so I say, well, imagine that, you know, you've never tasted a corn chip, or that you know, you've never been to any planet but Earth. And I ask you, what is your favorite planet other than Earth? You know, it's not a question that makes sense to people who don't think that way. But I think once upon a time, that thought was required. And I know that's a full-on thing to say, but I really do think it was required, because we did not have the inventory scientifically to rationalize so many things around us. And through that perception of divinity, be it you know, benevolent or malevolent, so much artistic expression was spawned from that. It's not funny. You know, and even architecture, like architectural feats that are just crazy, even by today's standards, were achieved through this pushing of human endurance. That was only possible due to that religious thought. Because
aiming higher.
Oh my goodness, yes. Because from a simple point of view of self-preservation, it was not rational. You know, so people were able to transcend that. You know, be it through the promise of indulgence or whatever, and that's just one example. But the book was quite diplomatic in the way it was clearly written by an atheist. But you know, it was just trying and like for instance, I took some time to work as a nurse many years ago. I'm still you know, working as an artist, but. And I worked with in a nursing home which cared mainly for elderly people in the Greek Orthodox community, which is where my sort of parents were part of. I'm not religious at all, right? Not at all. I have a deep interest in religion. Like I've read, you know, Bible, Quran, the whole kit and caboodle. The Bible was a slog though. It took me a while because I read the Old Testament and the New. The interesting thing is, a lot of those people were deeply religious, but they were people that you know, some of them, and this was a while back, were born at the end of World War I. You know, I cannot. It's very difficult for me to empathize with people like that, because I cannot even imagine what they went through. You know, and how they could keep going. You know. And some of them, you know, they got to the end and that's all they had. You know, there was a woman whose son died of old age and she was still going. And all she had was her kind of faith and her belief. And what person in their right mind would go up and say, you know what, there's no empirical evidence for any of that, and you know, blah 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 blah. Why would we do that? Like it's obvious that there's a thought process there that's kept this person going, for better or worse, but still kept him going. So I'm not a big fan of the aggressive anti sort of religion movement. I think it kind of probably should know its place. You know, some people don't like hearing that, but really the whole church and state thing, hell no. You know, that's very obvious. I don't want, you know, laws penned by those people. But you know, if one of the greatest sounds I've ever heard is a pipe organ in a cathedral, you know, it really is the most incredible sound. And that wouldn't exist were it not for that entire, that's not a historical footnote. That thing exists for a reason, and that building is structured that way for a reason. And that's why this stuff is not, it's not caveman stuff written on the skin of a yak. It's a little bit more than that. I think people need to kind of acknowledge it. And some of the greatest thinkers that we've had, in the maybe 19th, 20th, 20th century, some of these people were pretty deeply religious. And they were a shitload smarter than I am. That's for sure. So it's worth considering what that point of view is.
Yeah.
Do I believe in talking snakes? Probably not. But but yeah, I hope that kind of. I'm trying to do this diplomatically. Right?
No, I hear you, and I appreciate your empathy. In the scenario, I think that when we talk about a survival strategy, I think it's very useful to have a unifying narrative. And when we bring people together under a common narrative, we were talking about somebody who's going through a rough time of the day, and they're one of these zealous atheists, which seems like it should be an oxymoron, but it's not. You've already identified it, and I, my wife and I were talking about it. I was like, I don't know what I would do in that scenario. And when I think about that person, I actually can't identify their guiding narrative currently. And so I don't like, are they just sort of loose in the wind? Because I wouldn't want to be going through a tough time in life where I'm just like completely untethered. I think that's probably a big problem. And you want to be, and I don't have a religious belief either. I think fundamentally, and actually, one of the things that shook the internet in the last year or so is actually Dawkins said that basically culturally he's a Christian. He's not a Christian. He's one of the most famous atheists there are, but culturally he actually more or less believes Jesus said a lot of good stuff. He should probably do that. We get that. The deity part of it is something questionable, possible. But morally we're tethered to something, and that's a unifying narrative. And so when people talk about the evolution or colonialism and such, and talk about coming in and people taking over with their needs. So I'm not so sure it wasn't just creative destruction and evolution. If you come in, most of the cultures, the tribal cultures, had some sort of a sacrificial belief system where you sacrificed an animal, possibly your own children, a blood sacrifice, whatever it happened to be, a crop. There was something that you were required to give up something to please the gods. Right. And if you came from one of these systems where they were sacrificing the crop or the animals you couldn't afford to lose because you were barely on the edge, or worse yet, your children, and someone came along and said, I identify with your sacrificial system, but I have some good news for you. My God, who's the real God, made the final sacrifice. Instead of asking you to sacrifice your kid, he sacrificed his own kid, so you don't have to do that anymore. Most people were like, well, that sounds pretty good. That sounds better than I wish you had told me that last week before I sacrificed my daughter, or my goat or whatever it happened to be. But I think that actually the consolidation of religions throughout the world has mostly happened through, that sounds like a better idea. But there was a unifying narrative that sort of said, I understand that language. And we had to evolve one step sort of to the other, in the same way that you're probably familiar with this. The current AI systems, or the large language models, are built on, from my understanding, a GAN system, right? A generative adversarial network. You familiar with this concept?
No, I'm not. I'm not familiar.
Okay, so we have two computers who are basically playing a game of chess against each other. Chess, narrative, story, and let's take it to your field, where the one computer is meant to make a compelling image of let's just say a guitar, actually. Okay, a guitar, because it's life with strings attached. So the computer is meant to generate, and it's been trained on a whole network of a whole database of guitar images. So it says, create something that's a guitar. Now there's another computer. It's a judge, and the judge's job is to say whether that's a real guitar or not, and whether you made it or whether you gave it an existing picture of a real guitar.
Okay.
Basically. And so the generator, based on its large language model, the database of guitar images, makes something and it doesn't look a lot like a guitar. And the judge goes, you made that up. You're not fooling me. And the generator has to say, you're right. I have to get better. So it has to try and get better. The judge, however, made the right call. It gets to remain the same. Now, as the generator gets better, eventually it sends a series of existing pictures of a Les Paul, a Stratocaster, a Martin D28, whatever. And every time it says that's a real guitar, it's like, oh, you're right. Eventually it sends it another fake guitar, a generated guitar. And it says that's a real guitar. And goes, I got you. Now, the generator gets to stay the same. But the judge has to get better at judging. And it has to evolve. And they one up each other over time until eventually this adversarial game between the two of them improves both the generation of convincing images and the judging of the images. And so it's this generative adversarial network, a GAN system, that we're using computers to quickly, because they're doing this way faster than I just said. They're not meandering through a conversation like a couple of old men, the way I put it on,
So is the implication there that they're actually swapping roles, or are they both intrinsically the same role? It's just one is put in the position.
Only one generates.
Okay.
And the other one its job is to judge. So, and as you know, that perception, that judging right now is a big question as to whether we can identify when something has been faked or not effectively. I was in Japan recently, and I had heard, so there's a lady who's been working in AI for 40 or 50 years. She's a very early AI worker here in Italy, who I had the pleasure of having a dinner with a few months ago. And she works both at the university in Milan and in Tokyo, but she does a lot of AI work over there. And she told me that there's this robot that goes around the lab, and its job is to get you to fall in love with it. And it has basically in Japan. Okay,
in Italy,
no. So in Italy, you just have to give it a tasty ragu, and any Italian will fall in love with you. So in Japan, this robot's going around and getting you to care for it, and just does it through sort of movements and facial gestures. It basically is a computer screen, and she said, sure enough, within 72 hours, you will care for the robot. Oh. And we were in the massive, I forget the name of it now. There's a huge, it's actually got a camera name. It started off as a camera shop. There's a massive electronics chain in Japan. Yodobashi camera, that's it. Yeah, which is unbelievable. It's like a theme park of electronics.
It's my favorite place in the world, Jamie.
Yeah, okay, all right. That's the first time I held a Hasselblad in my hands. So we were in Yodobashi, and there were one of these, I don't know if it's the same robot. There's a robot that fit the description in a little pen, and it could move itself back towards its charging. It could go back and deal with the entropy issue. and so it would come out and it would just look at you, and it would look up at you, and it would make faces at you. And I began to care for this damn little thing very quickly.
Oh, I'm guessing here. Was it something you could anthropomorphize? Was it human looking in any way, shape, or form? Or
no. It was more or less. I don't remember the exact shape of it, but it wasn't the whole. I mean, think about what was that film that Pixar did with the robot? That
WALL-E.
WALL-E didn't look very human-like, and you fell in. Everyone loves WALL-E.
It's big sad eyes.
And that's it. It just had this rounded screen that made gestures of eyes and eyebrows and a mouth, enough of the key identifying features for us to evoke emotion. And it indeed did. And so
I got to check this out now. I didn't know about the existence of this thing. But yeah, the fact that it has eyes is interesting, because you know about the whole thing where cars have eyes. Have you ever heard about that?
Yeah.
But I've got to check it out. But I'm glad you went to. I have two stops in Osaka. One's Yodobashi, the next is Ishibashi.
That's exactly where we were. We were in
Yeah,
Osaka.
yeah.
It was Yodobashi.
That's the big one.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
okay, okay. There's a few things I'll have to check out there. But the testing thing is interesting because we use in my work we're more and more into AI generated images.
Yeah.
We have to be.
Yes, of course.
It's a little frustrating for us because the client expectations of what AI imaging can do are not in line with what can actually be done right now. But they really do think we can press a button and avatar will come out, and it's like not quite, but because all they're thinking is we just want it cheaper and faster. So why can't you just do this? But we are looking into it, and it is freaking cool. Like, and I've done a lot of images, and it's if I do a pitch document, for instance, if I'm looking to direct something or put together some sort of a mood board, man, Midjourney for me has been just completely life changing. And I think we touched on this last time was the interesting advantage that I have with a lot of coworkers was my English skills. Funnily enough. Midjourney is extremely responsive to English, like it's as simple as that, and English metaphors and slang and all this sort of stuff. And when you get other languages, like for instance Mandarin, Mandarin is a very metaphorical language. It's super hard to understand. Like some of the words, if you were to just do a literal translation, it is crazy. Right, but to them it makes total sense because there's this degree of metaphor. I don't want to kind of speak. I don't know a lot of Mandarin. I find it a very difficult language. But it's something like Midjourney. I think right now I don't know if Midjourney does understand Mandarin, but there's a certain way you can word things in English, and there's a certain thing you can apply in English that Midjourney gets. And it makes it very easy for me to get what I want out of it. But a lot of other people find it quite difficult because of that limitation. They know what they want, they just don't know how to describe it that well.
Yes.
But the expectation with AI right now, the frustrating thing for me, not to sort of come at it cynically, because you can't afford to be cynical. It doesn't matter what I think. This is where things are going. Is that the push to replace the artist is a bit of a weird thing for me. I get that we want to create product and content, and that we want automate things to a degree, but what we certainly don't want to do is just to stagnate, as I said before, because it's very easy to stagnate with content when you start generating it with something like Midjourney. It'll become very derivative very, very quickly. And I think I talked about it as well, this creative inbreeding that's kind of already happening with AI images, where it's starting to, AI is literally validating what it's creating with AI. So, at what point does six fingers become normal?
Right.
I don't know. But the what we're actually seeing is we're seeing extremely creative people that can pull amazing results out of this stuff. It's very likely and very possible for them to be able to work in a way they've not been able to work with before, to express themselves in a way they haven't been able to before, and produce things quicker. Which is sometimes great because, man, these things can take a really long time to make, and finishing them can be a real challenge when you've got life to do. So being able to get it done quicker is good for us. But there's this perception that the client, that and I've heard this a few times. It's ridiculously arrogant. They'll get a hold of these tools and they won't need the artist anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not so sure about that, because you're thinking of the artist like a craftsman. You're not thinking of the artistic side of it.
Yeah.
And at what point will your creativity or lack thereof start to show? I think that's hugely important thing to consider, is that a lot of us got into this because we're creative people, and we ended up making a living of the craft associated with that creativity. That earns the money. But the creativity is still there. And that I think it's maybe in a little bit of danger right now, and maybe a little. I don't want to be pessimistic because I'm having a blast with these tools. We're doing really fun shit.
It has to be in danger. It always is. Because we're talking about supply and demand, and just like everything else you talked about in your career, that when there were very few people who could do it, it was lucrative. And as it became more and more easy, as the software got democratized, the information got democratized, who goes to the library to learn something? You don't. You pull out your phone, you Google it, or something of the sort, right? And so, we all are very happy for not having to stand in line to wait to talk to the librarian to help you find the book that may or may not be in that library, right? And so, that's how things become more accessible and less expensive. That's the supply and demand happens everywhere. However, you're talking about sort of the controversial artesian divide, that divide between the artist and the craftsperson, what that difference is. And of course, this is very relevant here in my line of work. And that has to do with, there are people who can replicate a guitar and who can do that work, who are having a hard time standing out amongst the competition. And that's where the design and the artistry comes in usually, and it takes that sort of work to sort of be able to elevate yourself. But the problem with that is, if you take an aesthetic approach, which generally you have to, so if we look at basic industrial design sort of theory, Raymond Loewy talked about two products of equal quality, function, and price. And if they equal quality, function, and price, then they'll choose the better looking one. And now we rely on the designer and the artist to sort of, if you've got the function, quality, and price leveled out, and Raymond Loewy made a history of beautifying functional objects and also making them more functional. But the first thing was just to beautify them. And so, the problem with the beauty part is the necessity of the artist. And I say problem from the people who are paying the bills. Okay. It's a necessity of the artist. And the real challenge here is the same skills it takes to make it are the same skills it takes to judge it. And this is in everything. It's the same thing. It's like the most advanced mathematics can only be judged by somebody who can do the most advanced mathematics. And so, I'll give you a really simple scenario here. A number of years ago, I was asked to make a display for somebody. I'll keep it super vague. And the timeline was short and it was all about the product. And so I made a very clean, white, gallery-like display. The next year, someone came in and said, well, that's easy. There's nothing to this place, right? And they did an iteration of the next year of what I did, except they didn't apply the same thinking behind it, the same logic behind it. They just thought that it was about austerity, which it was not. And one of the critics, the CEO told me that one of the critics, looked at it and he asked them what they thought of the two things. He said, well, listen, when Jamie did it, it looked like a gallery. When the other person did it, it looked like a flea market.
Interesting.
What's the difference? An art gallery is an empty room with good lighting and good proportions. It's somebody who understands negative space, somebody who understands the approach and the experience, right? But effectively, it's an empty room. And so there is something about artistry, which is being able to identify, when it's too much, when it's not enough. And it's the artist who says to stop, because there are some artists who work with many apprentices or employees, but still the artist who comes and says, no, it's not ready, more this, whatever it is, or that's too much, go back to where we were. And that's the person ultimately in the end who was the artist in the scenario. And I don't think we're ever going to remove that from creative products. Will there be fewer people because we don't need someone to just make a rendering of a Coke can anymore that comes for free in the software? You just get to throw on whatever label you want now, right? Yeah. You have those building tools. I'm not sure you're not rendering from the beginning every time you need to draw like a pop can or something. No. Most people aren't, right? The building blocks are there. So, anyways, that artistry I think is really there. But there are people who are just technicians, and the technicians, there won't be a need for so many technicians, but the artist will be. Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Prominence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com.
Yeah, my concern with this is what you're talking about in terms of the gallery space and things like that, versus what a huge amount of content being consumed by people is at what point, and we kind of, it's somewhat related to the whole thing we were talking about earlier, where how long before people will notice, this stuff's fake or not, because their attention span's so short. An art gallery requires attention, in my mind. You go in and you go in to fixate on something or to look at it or observe it. Sometimes it doesn't work, but that's kind of the aim, I think, is to get people to look at things for longer than 2 seconds. With a lot of content being generated now, I wonder at what point will the people who are buying this stuff will decide it really doesn't matter, doesn't need to be any better than that, And I think that's what worries me, because we like, people will look at it. People like yourself or myself or whatever look at it and go, that is rubbish. That's just crap, or like, as you said, a flea market. But at what point will society as a whole say, we don't really care, we're going to eat it anyway? That's what bugs me.
I mean, we always cycle back the other way. I mean, you and I lived it with the grunge movement. The grunge movement.
Sorry.
You're laughing because it's true, right? And it was to the point where the perfection, the faster solos, the tighter playing, the higher singing, the longer notes, the bigger drum set was unbelievable. And enters, 3 guys who refuse to wash their hair, and don't care about playing a good guitar solo and don't sing in tune. And all of a sudden that seemed really authentic for most people. Right. And so they bought into that. And that's when the MTV Unplugged series came along. The same Eric Clapton that a few years ago had shoulder pads and feathered hair with a pink and blue Stratocaster with lace sensor pickups and a Wilkinson roller nut was playing a vintage Martin on stage in a t-shirt and a pair of jeans, because we cycle sort of back through these cycles. And they actually happen about every 11 years. I've documented it with the guitar and the evolution of the guitar and the evolution of music. And so we move towards this futurism, but eventually futurism doesn't feel real. And so we go back towards, let's make America great again.
Oh dear.
The campaign before Make America Great Again was Hope. And it was about a bold new future. And the one before that was about put prayer back in schools. Golden years, future. Golden years, future. You can see it very clearly in American politics. Every once in a while, there's a blip, and that was Reagan. Reagan was a conservative in a time where it didn't seem very conservative. And that's because 11 years don't work out within 8-year election cycles. And every once in a while, there's a blip where it moves. And so I feel so confident about this that I think there's always a role, because in our humanity, just like we talked about earlier on, there's this sort of pull towards the TikTok 5-second, but it's always juxtaposed with a portion of society that's saying, let's go play a board game and use film and figure out if I can, develop that film in my own room without blowing the house up.
Yeah.
And so that's just part of our humanity. It's part of our finding our equilibrium. And to bring it really back to the cellular level, it's us moving towards what we need and away from what we don't need.
It's all very tidy for you. I'm glad.
Well, I'm a big student of Brancusi's theories, and that whole idea of that simplicity is complexity resolved. And so I try and resolve complex issues into the most simple form I can all the time. And all of those things that I just talked about, by the way, are all Jamie sitting behind a steering wheel thinking about guitar. Every one of them led me towards thinking about futurism and golden years and why we went through these cycles, what the synthesis is, and what the most simple understanding of sound could possibly be. I've gotten it down to 3 words, at this point in time, which led me to the origins of intelligence. Because sound is movement, which is energy and movement are the same in a physics sense, plus time, because that's how we measure the movements within a given time and agree upon them, and perception. So it's movement plus time and perception. And the reason perception is important is because the movement in time, perceived not by our ear, but by our eye, we call light. And that movement in time gathering over our palate, we call taste. And so it's all perception. And that perception and movement are the very first beginning of intelligence on a molecular level, as we talked about earlier on. And so everything we do is movement and perception. And that helped me understand the materiality of a guitar and how to affect the instrument and how to shape the sound the way we want it by making obstacles or creating affordances to move the energy into the areas of the movement that we want to move and where we don't want to move. And that we would then understand them with a high frequency, that's very little time between movements, or a low frequency with a lot of time between movements. So we either need to insert time into the system to lower the frequency, or remove time from the system to increase the frequency. And that's the same with color and light as it is with sound. And it's the reason that cheese smells stronger as it warms up, because it's moving faster and it comes across our palate more often. And so the whole world sort of comes together in the most simplified version of this complexity, which is movement and perception. Which is why I'm super interested in what you said about the fact that our cameras don't see that. But this conversation is already a 2-part series. We're going to move into a 1-month, 4-part series with Kosta Lagis.
You can't do that to me. You can't bring up camera sensors right at the end. That'll like bring me to life. But no, it's fine.
Well, actually, here's the thing: is I would love for you to. Just respond to what I just said, which I know was a lot. And do you see something within your particular skill set? And don't worry, I'm prepared to cut this into 2 episodes if we need, because it's a good conversation. And so seriously, movement, time, perception, does that mean anything to you within your work and camera sensors or anything else?
Yeah, well, look, movement and time for me are pretty much the same thing. So I know that's probably not something you'd be satisfied hearing, but to me, they are.
I'm going to get you right off the top, though. Time is a measurement, like a kilometer or a centimeter. The only reason time is a part of the equation is because we have to agree upon where we start and end, and that 440 movements happened within that 1 hertz, that 1 second. And that's the A string of a violin. So time is only useful as a measurement. Otherwise, we could remove it from the equation.
Well, we could, but then you'd have nothing to be relative to. And then
that's right. That's why it's necessary.
But you could say that's true of anything. So you could say that's true of light itself. So when you look at the phenomenon of time dilation itself, you can see that a photon itself can look like it's traveling 2 completely different distances depending on how far away you are from it and how fast it is moving. So that is time itself perceived quite differently. Based on this photon moving from this point to this point, and then if it's moving aboard, let's say a spacecraft going a certain speed, it's now moving diagonally that far, which is quite a bit further. So perceived from outside of the ship, that's longer. Perceived in the ship, that's shorter. So everything is subject to being relative. Without sort of starting to sound pseudoscientific. So, but for me, for us in what we do, we tend to deal in Cartesian space, X, Y, Z. Then we need to introduce the W axis, which is the variable over time. Now, whether or not something is moving, right, at each point where you measure time, where you sample it, for want of a better term, it is in a state, and that's it. That's all that's relevant. Now, if it does start to move, then that's as relevant as a changing color or shrinking or whatever. You could perceive that as movement. But here's the interesting thing: when you move around it, is it moving?
when you move around it.
Let's say I move the camera around it,
Yes.
right? Is it
Yeah.
moving? Okay. It's moving relative to the camera, right? But in reality, in Cartesian space, it's completely still. So you've got screen space, you've got the viewer's point of view, you have everything. But for that to work, something needs to move, right? But for me, if you have time, if you have a timeline, whether we're working in the vastly simplified version of time, which is our w-axis or our timeline, if you will, then at each point that is technically the same thing as things moving because they're continuing, right? For something to continue, for something to persist is relevant enough for me, right?
Yes.
So if it's not persisting, then it's gone and then it's not moving. That's to me why those two things are a little bit somewhat the same.
I can accept that.
Yeah. So there was time, movement, and perception, or was your third, right? Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, perception I think is ideal in mostly visual, mediums. But for me, perception is also this thing. So it can't be relative to anything unless it's being perceived, right? I know that sounds like a huge, broad, sweeping statement, but unless it's perceived, how is it measured?
That's right.
For something, and this is going to get a bit zen and quite philosophical, but if there's nothing there to perceive it, is it there? Does it even exist? Because can it be given a name, a classification at all? Is it even objectively there if nothing's there to objectify it? So perception is necessary as well. But we're talking about
a great example of that is a rainbow, which requires a trajectory. It requires 3 points, right? There is no rainbow without an eyeball because it's a refraction, and if it doesn't arrive somewhere, it's not actually a rainbow. Yeah.
And of course, people have said, sound requires an ear. And I'm like, well, the perception of sound, yes, but there is it also requires air in which to move and vibrate through and to get these wavelengths to go through to get this particular frequency. They exist whether or not the ear is there, but is it a sound? Well, that's
what I'm talking about, though.
Yeah.
That's why perception is a necessary part of it. And the reason I identify it as, like, without the eardrum, it is not sound. It is simply movement. It actually takes that movement interacting with, in our case, our eardrum, our canal, for it to move at a certain frequency, for our auditory receptors to translate that into the movement. And on an evolutionary level, that movement is exactly that. How far, how close, how fast is that thing moving, right? It must simply have evolved so we could identify the sound of a tiger roar and how far away it is, right? Is it behind us? Is it in front of us? And that's the whole point of our auditory perception. But if we just take the same sort of molecules moving, it's that reaction that when we identify it with our eye that we call light, and the same amount of and why time is important is it's the amount of movements within that given time, that frequency, how frequent the movements are, that we identify as one color or the other, or that we identify as heat or cold.
Well, color's a bit different to that, but I do take your point.
I mean, when we identify the color and the warmth of a color in a room, we talk about how many movements there are within a given period of time, whether it's cool light or warm light.
Wavelength of the light spectrum and
measured within an agreed upon time period, right?
Yeah. True. For instance, when you white balance something, it tends to be done in hertz.
Yes. But a hertz is how many movements within a second.
Yeah. But I heard a hilarious anecdote relating to what you were talking. It's not. It's more of a joke, but I liked this. Someone was talking about elephants, and they said elephants are so amazing. Did you know they have a sound? that says, "Don't go there. There are bees there." Isn't that incredible? Wouldn't it be great if humans had that sound? And somebody answered and said, We do have that sound. It's don't go there. There are bees there."
Yeah,
that's the sound.
but it's also this incredible. If there's a lot of that, be careful.
Excellent pun. I think I think you can you can break sound down and you're talking about something kind of deep there, which is what is it the very base level of why you might react to a certain sound in a certain way, and you're talking about speed and things like that and how we respond to it, and that's going beyond even an existential understanding of things. You could probably measure this stuff, and I don't know if you've looked into that, but I dare say there'd be something there where you could probably trigger different responses in people without them really knowing, without them even having a subjective link.
Yes,
that would be the key thing, because I think once you introduce a subjective link, that's when things become very biased very quickly. For instance, if like a dog barking is a sound people will respond to very differently depending on their experience with dogs.
Yes.
But how does and this is the problem with kids, is we can't really communicate with them very well.
Yeah.
What does a baby think when they hear that? They don't even know that's a dog. They just know that's a certain frequency at a certain volume from a certain distance.
That's right.
What actually goes through that undeveloped brain at that point? And that is a super interesting topic, really, really interesting topic. Yeah. And, I think we take a lot of that for granted, and a lot of the building blocks of why we find sound, vision, design, all these things appealing. At their very core, people are going to be like, yeah, we don't really know why people like triangles when they're facing that way, but we just do, So the question of why, is super interesting. And you think you figured that out?
Well, I don't think I've figured out everything about so every group of study has an intent. Usually you make a theory, right? A thesis, and you try and prove it. And for my purposes, I was trying to understand materiality. So when we're shaping things. And so actually last year, me and an architect from New York, Ed Keller, put together a symposium at the Venice Biennale of Architecture, where one of the topics, we had 3 topics that day: icon, gesture, and the third one was on the materiality of sound. It's because I recognize that when I speak with an architect or an acoustic designer or an engineer, a guitar maker, which I speak to a lot of guitar makers, that nobody really uses the same language set when talking about sound. And they use them purposefully for their case study, for the use. And so I brought together people from all these different disciplines, including neuroscientists and AI specialists, because AI specialists are dealing a lot with, are we asking the right questions? Because we ask the computer something, and it gives us something that we did not intend, but it's not the computer, it's our question. Right? And so it's teaching us a lot about our understanding. And so for my purposes, when I think about movement in time and perception, what I'm thinking about is the body of an acoustic guitar or an electric guitar. It's the same thing. When people talk about the pickups make the wood irrelevant in an acoustic guitar, it just means they don't understand movement in general. The movement of the string is completely relevant to the energy transmission from the string into the body of the guitar. And that string is in a relationship in the system with the wood of the guitar. And therefore, the movements disrupting the magnetic field that it's sending out that cable through to the amplifier are different because of how it's reacting within the system, right? But if we look at an acoustic guitar, it's a little bit easier to understand. That top of an acoustic guitar, we thin that membrane to get a certain amount of amplitude towards it, right? So the same amount of given energy going into the system, if we make that top a little bit thinner, it will get a little more amplitude within a certain amount. It always maxes out at a certain point, right? But there's another way to gain more amplitude, and that's to retain the energy longer so it doesn't leave the system. And so a set of rosewood back and sides has a less efficient energy transfer from the spruce into the rosewood. It acts as an obstacle. And because it's an obstacle, the energy stays in the spruce longer, and the spruce travels further, gaining more amplitude. And because it travels further, it takes longer to do it. And therefore, we have more time between the top and the bottom peaks. And therefore, it has a lower frequency on the push and the pump of the system. And we perceive that as a lower frequency because it is a lower frequency. Now, when we change those sides to mahogany, it actually receives the energy easier. It's a better conduit, and the energy leaves the spruce faster. And therefore, we say it has less low frequency. If everything else is the same, because the energy transfer is happening more efficiently. And so we say it has more attack, and we say it has more mid frequencies as opposed to low frequencies in that instrument. But does it have to be that way strictly because of the materiality? I would make the case that the shaping of the system is more fundamental than the material itself.
Yeah, I'd go with that as well. Bracing, the resonant peak formed by the fact that there's a giant hole in it. Generally,
and then we can change the aperture, and when we change the aperture, we slow down. So we insert time into the system by slowing it down, and we actually the fundamental goes lower, and we change that aperture to a smaller amount. When we open up the aperture, the pitch goes up, and so if we lengthen the amount of grain that we have, a shorter grain it's very stiff, longer grain with the same thickness has more movement in it. So my understanding of movement and time and perception all had to do with the shaping of materials that we're using for acoustic purposes.
Okay.
When I realized that, I'll just tie the one last bit in. When I realized it was movement and time, and that the perception of the ear was absolutely fundamental for us to perceive that as lower or higher frequencies, because it's a physical interaction. Actually, our auditory perceptors, when we use what do we call the implants for people that are hearing impaired?
Cochlear
implants.
Yep.
They actually perceive much lower and higher frequencies than our eardrum is capable of. And they have to filter them out. And so our brain is capable of understanding higher and lower frequencies than our eardrum is shaped for, presumably based on the predators. The people who had different hearing probably got eaten. So when I realized movement and time was the same thing, I said, for light, I said, wait a second, does that mean it is for smell and for taste and for touch? And as I explored them, I realized, oh, it actually is. And I've tested it now with all sorts of people who are acoustic engineers, physicists, the aerospace engineer from Lamborghini. Everyone has a different use for how they're working with the physics. But so far, the theory stands, and I haven't had anybody debunk it. You might be the first. Here's your shot.
I don't know if there's anything to really debunk. You're talking about the measuring of frequencies fundamentally.
Yes.
Is what you're talking about.
Exactly.
And a lot of what we break down is in wavelengths. When we talk about light and sound, we essentially do it the same way. We do it in wavelengths, which is a sample at any given time.
That's right.
Of how something is.
A sample of movement in time.
Yeah. Well, here's where you can get a bit crazy with it if you want. If you want to go down to a subatomic level, and you can argue that at a certain point things aren't moving, they're quantifying. You could get a little bit ludicrous with it, but I think that's the fact that at the subatomic level things function quite differently. I think that would be.
There's a point where we start to add complexity to simplification.
But that's the thing. That's the interesting thing about the subatomic level is it doesn't behave the same way, and that's what's really interesting about it. But what you're talking about is more closely tied to what we would call traditional Newtonian physics, which is this. We have this wavelength, we have cause and effect. Yes. I think that's you're talking about the act of sensory measurement, which is not a thing I think needs to be debunked. I think it's how we measure things really as beings with senses. I think the way we describe light, though, it's a little bit different to sound in that I guess it is kind of the same. It's the same enough to not necessarily invalidate what you're saying, but when we talk about light spectra and what we perceive, and the fact that there are people alive that have an extra color cone now that see a primary color that we all do not, that's where light starts to get a little bit more tricky, and where we wonder if your red is the same as my red, because light arguably goes through a little bit more of a complex path to be perceived by the brain than sound. That's not to say sound is simple, and we probably don't fully understand either. That's
sure
probably a guess on my part, but I would argue that we probably don't. But like light itself and the way photons behave, in the very fact that nothing is faster than a photon and cannot be faster than a photon, and there's a very good reason for that. And I mean, I know we all love the idea of time travel and all this sort of stuff, but when you look at the logic behind why something can't travel faster than light, it's not actually that complicated. It's sort of loosely tied to what I was talking about before with time dilation. Sound is not really subjected to the same rules as that. You can very easily travel faster than sound.
Yes.
Like
not so easily, Kosta. It took us quite a few millions of years to develop a machine that helped us do it. Carry on.
Okay. Let me read. You can't simply travel, but any one of us, could, actually make
theoretically, yes.
But things, but nothing travels faster than light. And, and the way light is perceived is quite different. And what we use light to measure is different as well. I don't think sound itself is a very good tool of measurement. Light is a very good tool for measurement. So I think the two are a little bit different, but in the way that we can abstract both of them as frequencies if we're going to talk about color rather than photons if we don't want to go into photons.
Let me give you an example of sound measurement that you might not be considering. I just want to take light might be a better way to measure. I don't disagree. But of course, that depends on context. Better always depends on objective and context. And so there's an experiment that was called the Heard Island experiments. Have you heard of it by chance?
Do not know.
No? Okay. So in the Heard Island experiments, they had constructed a massive speaker and they put it into the ocean, and they told the scientific stations around the world, who are always listening, they're listening for cracking of icebergs or listening for whale calls, doing different things, to say, we're going to make this sound, and they sent an example of it. If you hear it, could you please record the time and let us know? And the stations agreed to do so. And so they set off this sound, but they set off the sound within a particular space. And so the ocean is oriented in horizontal layers. And those layers have different sort of thermals, right? And so when whales communicate across long distances, they communicate within one particular sort of level where, because it's oriented like a layer cake, the ocean is, with different temperatures, it's actually a confining space within there for sound to sort of be kept within, let's say. And they set this off, and within a couple of hours, they heard the sound on the other side of the planet. Now, this movement within time that was perceived, they realized, because it is relevant to the density of the water, which is that time between molecules, right? That space between molecules. We can actually get a global average temperature by setting off the sound and timing it. And so it's actually how we measure the temperature of the ocean to know whether it's going up or going down, by setting off a sound within this because of density. So when the ocean heats up, it's less dense. And when it's colder, it's more dense. And that's effectively inserting time into the system or removing time from the system in the language that I have chosen to communicate. Not being a scientist, but being a guitar guy.
We're all sort of budding scientists in a way. I like to
yeah. But what's interesting about that is you get around a lot of issues that you would have a very hard time measuring with light in that way. First of all, curvature is certainly an issue that could be interesting. And I'm not saying that it's better. I'm just saying that for the purposes that actually it was the first time and the only way I think that scientists currently agree that we can get a reasonable sense of the global temperature of the oceans.
Yeah, look, I think that's fair. I mean, you're describing a scenario where you're not really using sound. You're using the density of the water, and you're
that
kind
is
of
sound. It's one movement hitting another molecule until they eventually interact with the receiver. That is what's happening when it hits. Now, the air are the gases. There's not nothing here. It's full of something, but we see right through it for the most part, except on long distances. We don't see through it because then the accumulation of water droplets, whatever, begin to obscure our ability to see through it. But air actually is density. And it's the reason that our voice goes higher when we use helium. Is actually it's what's happening is the sound is actually moving faster within helium because it actually has a lower density.
Yeah, what I was going to say there was
lower density. Yes.
Yeah, we had a way to use sound to measure density.
Yes.
So the question is there another way to measure the density, and do we even need one? Sound itself traveling, however, as a metric without the density is not really useful in that scenario. It's sound traveling through something.
That's right. Which is how we're determining the temperatures, because
how you hear things. So the question is
relative to the density.
Yeah.
Yes.
However, light kind of does the same thing. Light can be slowed down. Light can be obstructed very easily.
Sure.
Blocked, all these sorts of things. The thing is with sound, it can be outrun, and I think that's where you start to get into, like, a clap is a distance. If you were to measure the distance of something, or take something like a LiDAR versus something like a sonar. So we're sort of talking about a very similar thing there. We're talking about measuring a distance based on an echo, for want of a better term, sound bouncing off something. A LiDAR is exactly the same thing. It's just using light. And one would argue that, the LiDAR could rebuild something quite accurately. I'm not sure sonar could be, it's still accurate, but I don't know if it would be as accurate. And that's kind of the rationale I'm going off there.
When you think about a bat?
Yeah, sure, a bat. But
or dragonfly, the most effective hunter, and the dragonflies aren't using sonar. They're using light.
But a bat with LiDAR is pretty terrifying.
So a bat's using sonar, and a dragonfly is effectively using light. It's triangulating with vision.
Well, everything with two eyes is doing that. That's what we do. We triangulate light.
Yes.
Yeah, but they have compound eyes, so I'm not terribly sure. I'm no biologist, that's for sure. But when you look with your two eyes, you are triangulating. That's technically why we have two of them. But as a measuring tool, it was a very interesting example. I'd not heard of it, the one you sort of brought up for measuring density with sound. But sound certainly isn't the only way to measure density. No. I don't know if it's but in that case, it was the most effective. Sure. And yeah, I mean, there's horses for courses. You have to take that into account. On a hypothetical level, though, if we were to break everything down to, matter and what makes it up, and if we were to take a substance of a particular density and we were to use, various methods of testing that density, I would then argue, well, what is the best way of doing it? It might not be either light or sound. Who knows? But, in the field I work in, we certainly don't measure a lot with sound, anything actually. So, yeah, that's kind of the rationale I'm going off there. Bats with LiDAR, though, I think there's something in that. But Yeah, light is a funky thing, Jamie. Like, and light and photon behavior itself, and it's we do know a lot about it. This is the thing. Like, people like to have this mystical idea of science and what we do know, and they say, there's a lot we don't know. And I'm like, there's a shitload we do know, more than anyone could know. There's enough there for you to fill your brain. Don't worry.
Yeah,
but what I've understood about light are some of the things that have challenged my perception of reality. And not in a eat, love, pray kind of way. It's just like, holy crap, is that really how this works? And it, the effect of gravity on light, and gravity itself is an insane thing when you look at it, and what it actually does, and how unintuitive that is. To the human being, means our sort of level of exploration now has gone possibly beyond the fundamentals of survival, really, because none of this stuff seems terribly intuitive anymore. And I think that's why it's so weird and so alien. What does seem intuitive, I think you could link back to the things you're talking about on an instinctual level, if for want of a better term. That to me is probably at the heart of things that are intuitive, and we can talk about form, shape, color, light, sound, touch, smell, all that stuff. But gravity's effect on time, I don't think maybe someone has an intuitive understanding on that, but I don't think any human being in history has required that knowledge for survival. We might in the future. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that these are all different ways of us exploring concepts. And, perhaps the most important thing is not the understanding of the useful, but eliminating the things that have been detrimental through expanding our understanding. So we talked earlier on about religion, and possibly that the most useful thing is a unifying narrative, and as we expand our understanding, understanding begets empathy. When we understand that, that person they weren't trying to do that. They were a bit predisposed to doing that because of this condition or this way of thinking. And as we expand our understanding, that we are, I think, removing a lot of those little bits of things that people used to draw a sword for, that we don't, we don't try and duel somebody for the same shit we used to, and
it'd be nice every now and again, though, wouldn't it? Just demand satisfaction. I'd love to. Can I interject with two questions, which are very, I think, relevant to quite a few things you've said.
Yes.
One, I'm curious if you believe we have free will, and the second thing is, do you believe in objective, morality, like the duality of everything? Is that something you prescribe to?
So I heard a conversation between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson talking about this. And the thing that I really like what Harris had to say about this was, we can discuss a great deal about morality and such, but if there was a knob that we could turn, and turning that knob one click would make everybody's life just like a hair less better. Not like Thanos, where half the population is dying, everything of the sort, but everyone would just be just a hair less prosperous, just a hair less happy, a hair less healthy, but basically life continues on. I don't think there's anybody who has their faculties who would agree that we should turn it to the left and that everything should reduce. We would objectively agree that would be a bad thing to do. And as a result, I think that there is an objective bad and good.
Interesting.
That's Harris's argument. What do you think of that? You turn to the left and say, "Make me happy." No.
Well, here's the thing. This is the thing with that. I think I don't think I'd turn it to the left. Hell no. But I think some people probably would. and their sense of morality is caved into frustration or bitterness and all the rest of it, and they are in a particular state at a particular point in their life, and it's no less relevant to any other point. And the only way we can judge them is based on our own idea of what we would do, and that's kind of super interesting. Is that's how the way we would measure it is anecdotally is very telling to me, because we kind of do need that, don't we? I think it's undeniable that we really do need that, but maybe it is deniable. But I wonder if it's objectively real. I think it's a thing that,
I think we would categorize anybody who thought that was a good thing to turn to the left as a sociopath. We would just say they lack empathy, and therefore there's a problem with the system at that point in time.
Sure, we would, but that's an expression of your sense of morality, right?
Is it? If you can objectively demonstrate that somebody does not feel or show any signs of empathy,
are they amoral? Because a lot of surgeons are psychopaths. You know this, right? This is a crazy statistic.
It takes a lot of removal to be able to cut up somebody without feeling a great deal of remorse or hesitation on it. Yeah.
Well, and the not worrying about consequence while you're doing something.
Yeah.
This is another thing. So, but this is something that can be very effective, and I'm not championing it.
They're worried about consequence. They won't continue to get jobs. They won't continue to get paid. So they are moving towards taking care of their needs. They have to do a good job, and so they are worried about consequence.
They can fuck it up though, and that's the thing. And a lot of surgeons will and have, and they will have a failure rate. Yeah. And
me too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but the thing is, to them, for a lot of us, someone dying on a table, if we're responsible for them, would not be something we quickly got over. No. For them, it's a non-issue. But you have to ask yourself at that point: is that an effective member of society because of that mindset? I would argue yes. And this is where it gets really ropey, right? But the main thing with the sense of morality is can it be? It can't even be defined outside of an anecdote, right? It can't really be defined in a universal way, and that's an interesting thing to me. I have a sense of morality. I'm not saying I don't, right? But is there an objective sense of morality? I'm not sure, right?
Can you identify anecdote for me for a second? Your description of anecdote, please.
The anecdote?
Yeah.
When you were describing turning a knob.
Yes, but can you describe for me the concept of anecdote?
Anecdotal would be recounting a story, perhaps. That's the best I can do right now. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Is that an issue?
No. I just want to make sure that we're on the same track here.
Would you say our understanding of that word is the same, or do you think it's different?
No, it is. But the reason that I want to understand that we both see that as the same is because of what I'm thinking about in response to what you're saying. And that's simply, so there are groups of people who have impulsion issues. And so, and we've learned a lot about how our brain views the world, because when they see an open door, they cannot resist walking through it.
Right. Okay.
And therefore, a door has a narrative of something you go through. You pass through the port. In a way, it's not just it's not a board and hinges, or a way to move. That they must walk through it. And so there are psychologists who sort of say that this is an indication that everything we see in narrative, we see in the most useful low resolution version of it. And so there were examples that were given at, I believe it was Harvard University, where there were students with a map, so it must have been pre-cell phone, because who the fuck uses a map? But they had a map, and there would be like a visitor, And someone would walk up to them with the map and say, do you know where such and such is on the campus? And during the exchange, two other students holding a door would walk between them in the conversation. And the second person with the door would hand the door off to the student with the map, and they would take the map. So in this sort of little busy confusion, when the door passes through, the student who was holding the map now takes the door, and the person who was holding the door now is holding the map. And something insane, like 95 or 97% of the scenarios, the person being asked the question did not identify the person changed.
Oh, wow.
The only thing useful was student holding map that I don't know, stranger holding map, asking me question. Something of the sort that we do not view as much detail as we think. So the reason that the question of can we talk about any of this stuff outside of anecdote is I'm not sure we think outside of anecdote.
Well, we don't, and that's the problem. But we certainly don't measure with anecdote. See, that's where I take issue with it. Because generally for something to like, we can identify, for instance, through measurement, what the color red is. Yes. We can't necessarily recount what red looks like unless we use an anecdote, right? Or unless we describe something, for want of a better term, if we're differing there. With morality, I find it's the same. People can describe morality and their sense of morality, but I've yet to see a solid definition of it. Right, and that's the people can give you their moral, and they can write it out, and you can have a declaration of what you consider right and wrong. But I don't think that's measurable, and I think that's why objectively I don't think it really exists, which is a problem. Because it gives people an out. But so that's kind of what I mean, Jamie. I'm not saying it's not there and it's not part of the thought process. But I'm kind of curious, without kind of lingering here. But the free will part, I really want to know if you think we have free will.
My initial response is going to be we have free will. Yeah, and fuck you for making me sing a Rush song in my head.
Well, it's
I'm sorry, all the Rush fans in the world. I'm from Toronto. I'm from their hometown. It's not a bad thing. They wrote lots of good music. Apology. I would say that we have free will. Do you think we? What's fascinating to me is it makes me think that you don't think we have free will, which is fascinating for somebody who's an atheist and even is questioning morality. The fact that you believe in predetermination.
No, I don't think anything determined it. I don't think it's determined. I think that requires. I think it's inevitable, but it's not necessarily determined.
You were always going to say yes to this conversation.
Well, the fact of the matter is I did say yes to it. That's why.
Explain that to me.
Well, look, I think you've kind of already broken this down in a way when you break down human behavior to a cellular level. At what point do we control that? And I don't think we control that at any point. I think we perceive that we do, and we're at best a passenger. And the concept of you and I is an interesting thing. What makes you, and what is consciousness, and all this sort of stuff. But how exactly you are controlling matter that is, in essence, reacting to everything around it, I think that's a bit of an illusion, a very comfortable one, and one that we're all very convinced of as we behave. But how I'm reacting to things so quickly that I can manipulate them, it becomes more and more absurd the more you look at it. I don't think it's necessarily a very healthy way to think, and I don't think I go through life thinking that way, that I have no free will. But I think from an academic point of view, if I was to look at what matter's doing and the way my brain is actually working, I don't think I have any at all. No, I don't think I have any control over what's happening, and I'm not even sure I'm I. So if we're going to go that far into it, but That doesn't mean you're not accountable. But this is the thing, right? Not having
you
free
don't
will.
think that Descartes solved that issue? You don't think so?
Well, who's the other one? There's that Schopenhauer. I think his name was Schopenhauer, the guy, the will to power. If you've that was one. It was one of the famous pessimist.
Yes.
And that was an interesting take on it. That everything's at odds with being itself. I mean, it's quite dated, and you've got to wonder how happy that guy actually was before he came up with those theories. But
yeah, I mean, I think our universities are full of it, and honestly, it comes up in our podcast often. People talk about there being too many humans on Earth, and and that we're a cancer on the planet, and everything. It's actually really prolific within artists, and I think it's a really anti-human sort of perspective that has come through that sort of thinking. But nonetheless, I think that the reason it's relevant for us and relevant for our conversations is that the more humans are on the Earth, the more solutions there have been. And that has to do with our superpower. And that's creativity, which is what links you and I in these conversations is, we're both artists who have found a way to survive being creative. And much of my creativity these days is in solutions in business and conversations, helping people through things. But it's no less creative than when I'm playing guitar or drums or making an image or designing someone's trade show booth or color palette for their product. These are all things that I do, and it's all creativity. And it's the reason that the more humans there are on the planet, the more solutions we find.
That's interesting. Interesting way of looking at it. Yeah. Okay. I can buy that. I personally don't prescribe to the whole humanity as a cancer thing. I don't like that metaphor at all. I don't think it's, I don't think it's terribly, I think it's a bit of an edgelord thing to say. If people say that, it's just like, really, like, or the idea that you're insignificant for that matter. I find that a ridiculous thing for people to say.
Yeah.
They say, well, yeah, and this is coming from, I don't really believe in an ordered universe, but that doesn't mean you're insignificant, because we don't know of any other life yet. So that means it's kind of scarce. The universe is probably full of it, but it's not everywhere.
I mean, these same people would tell you they prescribe to the theory of evolution, and the theory of evolution means that it took millions of years to get to the Kosta that I'm talking to right now, which is pretty fucking remarkable.
Anyway, sorry.
So, Kosta, we must eventually wrap up this particular conversation, which I think is going to be in two parts at this point. And don't be. I've thoroughly enjoyed my conversation. It's exactly what I hope to have when I have conversations with people in general. I've loved it, and I wish I didn't have to say no. I wish I could just open a bottle of wine and we could sit here talking about it for a while. But for now, I must bear with people's attention to a certain amount. But I want to throw the last, kind of were your questions, but listen, if I were a better interviewer, was there a topic that you were hoping to discuss today, or a question that you were hoping that we would bring up that we should discuss before we wrap this up?
If you're a better interviewer, honestly, no, that was fine. It didn't feel like you were reading from a script, so that's kind of my
definitely no script.
That's because I don't have one either, so that would make me feel very insecure. No, totally okay. And we had it was a good chat. So that's the most you can hope for.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kosta, we do actually have one more segment we have to shoot here, and that is at the end of all of our conversations, we do a small segment we call The Business of Guitar, when they're not in the guitar business, the business of creativity, which you have been in for decades at this point in time. And so for anybody who's interested in the business of guitar / business of creativity, you can hear that on our Patreon. You can head over to patreon.com/business of guitar. That's patreon.com/business of guitar, where Kosta will give us some insights about how to remain in business as a creative, which he's done now in multiple countries and has learned skills over and over again. So I'm really interested to hear what he has to say on this. Kosta, thank you so much for being on life with strings attached. I'm so glad that I met you, and I'm glad that we've had this conversation and you took the time. I really appreciate it.
More than welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, and a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.